The US has taken a myriad of steps to restrict supplies of advanced computer chips to China, not just from the US, but from allied nations as well. US Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo said Washington needs to deny China this technology that's needed to advance the military. But analysts have pointed out the US is pursuing a technology monopoly and that these policies will raise global chip prices and hurt future technological research. What's the real purpose on the part of Washington? What exactly will be the ripple effects? Are US allies cooperating to help achieve the intended goals? I'm pleased to be joined from Beijing by Zhang Fan, Associate Professor of Beijing Normal University, and from Adelaide, Australia, Simon Lacey, Senior Lecturer of the School of Economics and Public Policy at the University of Adelaide. He is also former Vice President of Huawei Technologies. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Professor Zhang, let me go to you first. Now, in October, the Biden administration imposed the latest series of export controls in this matter. What do you see by now is the real purpose of US policies, and according to what international rules does the US take such actions?
So this, in my opinion, this is kind of a panic reaction to rectify a earlier mistake. So earlier, they imposed restrictions on exports of advanced chips to China, but instead of sort of crashing the Chinese manufacturers that uses those chips, it really made a cocoon for the Chinese domestic market to be captured by Chinese chip makers. So those guys are now advancing very quickly. So their sales goes up by 30% every year. And very recently, there's a memory chip manufacturer whose technology is surpassing the US. It's just falling behind South Korea just a little bit. So Apple sort of announced they want to use this Chinese makers' chips. And that really sort of run about in Washington. And in their new bill, this particular company is very heavily targeted. So you can see this kind of a reactive element in it. So
what's the ultimate purpose of the United States? Is to suffocate China's chip production or chip industry?
Yeah, so the chip industry is going up really fast, and it's becoming a real competitor on the global stage, and they want to just push it back down again.
Right.
So
all right, Professor Lacey, this is not the first of similar measures, if not same measures, but similar measures to achieve the same end, as I understand. And restrictive steps actually have been taken since 2018. Has the US so far achieved at least part of its intended goals, or does it envision an eventual effective blockade of China's chip industry or chip sector if it pursues this policy to its full?
Yeah, I think I really wonder whether people in the US have really sat down and thought about, what the long-term implications of this are, or what sort of the end game of this strategy is. I mean, certainly in the shorter term, it's achieved some of its objectives. I mean, the objective of hobbling Huawei was certainly achieved to a limited extent on foreign markets and in the rollout of 5G. But really, can you deny China this sort of technology in the long term? And if you deny it in the short term, then obviously won't it just develop that technology on its own in the long term? So really, I really wonder what sort of what the end game of this strategy is by American strategists.
But do you think apparently the US is trying to suffocate China's chip industry and all the related high-tech sector?
Yeah, I think if you're looking to understand, why this is happening, it's fairly clear that the US sort of sees itself as in competition with China across, multiple fronts, including economic, commercial, and military. And this is, competition. This is a competition where the only rule is really sort of to win. It was actually Penny Pritzker, who was Obama's Commerce Secretary, who said in 2016 that it was imperative that the US maintain its leadership in semiconductor technology, and Trump really sort of doubled down on that. So the overriding imperative is to maintain US dominance in this core technology.
Professor Zhang, as you just mentioned, according to Chinese numbers, China bought more than 300 billion worth of semiconductors in the first 10 months of this year, making chips its largest import. Meanwhile, China's exports of chips grew by 8% compared to last year, and the unit prices of its exports are also increasing, which means Chinese companies are actually benefiting from the rising chip prices as a result of US policy. And China is also speeding up its domestic chip development and sector. Can the US effectively control international trade on chips without hurting its own interests?
No. So this time, what's happening is that the Chinese chip makers have been making real good progress on both technology and their production of scale. They're making so much money. They're investing billions and billions of dollars across many cities in China to boost their production. So what the U.S. is doing now is going further upstream, try to cut off the equipment that these chip makers need to make the chips. So it's repeating the same game, but further up the supply chain. The U.S. vendors themselves said you can't be serious. You're playing the same game, giving this market back to Chinese competitors.
Yeah, one of the things that the US tries to do is to cut off supply of advanced chip making machines, for instance, from Netherlands or elsewhere. US Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo, as I said, she said in early November, that I think you will see that Japan and the Netherlands will follow our lead, but the Dutch Foreign Trade Minister actually said the Netherlands will not copy the American measures one-to-one. And the Dutch company ASML, which is one of the world's leading makers of chip making equipment, said it will continue to ship some lithography chip equipment to China, of course, not the extreme ultraviolet ones. So why are these countries taking a different stand, at least slightly distance themselves from the US policy, Mr. Lacey?
Yeah, I also read the comments of the Dutch foreign minister. I think it was interesting because the language he used was that the definition of the US for using of dual use technologies was not the official one. They'd sort of expanded the scope to go beyond what was officially recognized as dual use technology. I think the Japanese will fall in line with the US position. I think the big question mark is the Koreans, right? So you've got Samsung and SK Hynix that both have manufacturing plants in China, and Korea sort of does have a strong history of standing up to the US. At least initially on Huawei as well, but I think the Koreans are very hard-nosed about sort of making those decisions in terms of their own kind of narrow interpretation of what's in their national interest. So I think that's really the question mark: is will countries follow?
Mm-hmm. Well, countries are obviously under a lot of pressure, or regions, including the Taiwan region of China. You just mentioned Japan. Japanese observers have also warned that Japan's domestic chip industry will be scathed if Japan complies. And Australia, the country that you are based in, Australian Trade Minister Don Farrer actually said that Australia will use cool and calm foreign policy to limit trade problems early, so that maybe we don't have to go to the more draconian actions that the US has gone down. Mr. Lacey, once again, how do you look at these comments? I mean, are countries compelled to comply with US policies despite their own legitimate interests?
Yeah, I mean, what we saw in the Huawei campaign was that the US really just got increasingly sort of shrill in its demands, particularly vis-a-vis the UK, to sort of drop Huawei, and really sort of brought a lot of pressure to bear on other allies. And that succeeded to a certain extent, but I also felt that there was kind of a growing discomfort with China, which was sort of also accelerated by the initial uncertainty around the COVID-19 pandemic. I think countries have sort of recalibrated their stand towards China since sort of the end of the 2010s, and people are just a lot more, governments are a lot more wary of China. But I just think we'll have to wait and see how it plays out on how successful the US is really on convincing allies. I mean, the comments of Trade Minister Farrell, I think, are best sort of understood in the context of, a desire by the Australian government to really no longer sort of stoke the fires of confrontation between Australia and China and lead to a sort of more, to a calmer relationship and a more sort of productive relationship, one that's less driven by conflict.
Yeah, Professor Zhang, do you think the US worry that, the so-called dual-use technology will give China the kind of upper hand in doing bad things in the world? Do you think that kind of argument is grounded in facts and can serve as a basis for restricting international trade that are legitimate, that are actually protected by international rules on trade?
No, I mean, they find all sorts of excuses for trying to hold on to their technological monopoly. So in the 80s, they did even more drastic things against Japan, their own ally, and slapped some anti-dumping thing, forced Japan to voluntarily forego exporting their semiconductors. That's when the US came back up. So with China, it's all about competition. So it's military stuff, but China hasn't been involved in any war for so long. I mean, and dual use, if you compare American, military contractors' role in their economy, Chinese dual use is non-existent. In any case, that's not the excuse. If that's the excuse, something can be used for military purpose. Then you need to go and kill everybody, all the kids in the world, because they can become soldiers that fight American soldiers one day, right? So that's logically it doesn't follow. And rule-wise, their action against Japan was ruled to be against WTO rules later on, and then now they have this long-arm jurisdiction. They're not only restricting American companies, they're restricting American nationals that currently work for other companies. So there's a huge evacuation of Americans out of Chinese factories right now. Never mind, contractual obligations. It's all of a sudden everything's just out of the window. Your property is no longer your property. Contract doesn't mean anything. It's just weird now.
Many thanks to Professor Zhang Fan and Simon Lacey joining us for the discussion. With that, we come to the end of this edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. As always, you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle Liu Xin in Beijing. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.